Italy, late in the war. A narrow street ends in steel. At its far end, a Tiger tank blocks the road completely. Hull squared to the stone walls, engine running, gun forward. It does not fire. It does not need to. The infantry facing it understands the message at once. This street belongs to the tank, and anything that enters it must accept the terms. Rifles answer on instinct. Bullets strike the armor and burst into brief flashes of light, sparks skipping away as if embarrassed to be seen. The sound is sharp and urgent, but it achieves nothing. Against a Tiger, small arms fire is not resistance. It is proof of helplessness, announced out loud. Men press themselves into doorways and shattered masonry. The platoon leader counts seconds without meaning to. There is no artillery close enough to matter. No friendly tank that can arrive before the situation collapses. The stone walls deny maneuver. The street forces confrontation. The Tiger does not advance because it does not have to. Time is already doing the killing for it. The turret begins to rotate. It moves slowly, deliberately, with the confidence of a machine designed to outlast hesitation. The barrel sweeps past windows, pauses, moves again. Each adjustment feels measured, economical, as if the crew inside has learned that fear spreads faster when you let men watch the gun come toward them. This is how heavy armor wins without firing, by forcing infantry to choose between exposure and suffocation. Behind the line, something scrapes forward over broken stone. It is bulky, heavy, and unmistakably awkward. An infantry anti-tank launcher dragged into position by two men who already look tired of it. Its shape is wrong for heroics. Too thick, too mechanical. It resembles workshop equipment more than a battlefield solution, as if it were never meant to be admired, only used. A staff officer notices it and laughs, not because it is funny, but because laughter is easier than trust. A spring toy, he calls it, dismissing the weapon with a phrase that protects his pride more than it informs the fight. The men handling the launcher do not respond. They are busy managing its weight, aligning it by procedure rather than instinct. This is not a weapon that rewards confidence. It rewards obedience to steps learned under calm conditions that no longer exist. Down the street, the Tiger's turret continues its rotation. Inside the tank, the crew is enclosed in steel and belief. Belief in armor thickness, in doctrine, in a reputation earned on other battlefields. The Tiger has been taught that infantry will break first, that men will scatter before distance closes enough to matter. Experience has made that lesson feel permanent. The gunner with the launcher feels the opposite lesson pressing in. He knows the range is short, uncomfortably short. This weapon does not reach out across fields or hills. It demands approach. It asks a man to move toward the thing most likely to kill him and trust that geometry, not bravery, will decide the outcome. The platoon leader watches both certainties collide. If the launcher fails, the laughter will be remembered longer than the men who fired it. If it works, something larger than a single tank will break. Because myths do not die slowly. They die the moment someone proves them wrong at close range. The turret pauses. The distance is measured in seconds now, not meters. The street is silent except for the low engine rumble and the scrape of boots against stone. One shot waits inside an ungainly tube, either a final embarrassment or the end of a belief that has protected German armor since the war's beginning. And what none of the men on that street yet understands is this. The Tiger is not about to be challenged by courage, but by a problem Britain was forced to solve long before this moment ever arrived. By the middle years of the war, British infantry had learned a hard lesson that no parade ground could teach. Bravery was not a material. It could not be cast, machined, or hardened. And when German armor grew heavier, when steel thickness climbed and silhouettes became broader and more confident, courage began to meet a surface it could not penetrate. At first, the improvisations had seemed enough. Anti-tank rifles, grenades, bundled charges, sticky bombs, tools born of urgency and issued with stern optimism. They were workable when targets were light, when speed and surprise could compensate for thin armor. But the battlefield evolved faster than the paperwork that fed it. Every month the enemy learned, adapted, reinforced. What had been a solution in 1940 could become a ritual by 1943, performed because it existed, not because it worked. This was the cruel economy of mechanized war. Steel improved in factories, while infantry improved through casualties. German tanks began to appear in places that made doctrine irrelevant. Not neatly across open fields where anti-tank guns could be sighted and ranged like instruments, but around bends, through villages, out of tree lines, into the sudden intimacy of close country, where the first warning was the sound of tracks, and the second was the muzzle blast. The men who were supposed to stop armor often found themselves still moving their guns when the tank was already present, already dictating the fight. Commanders recognized the gap with a kind of private humiliation. On paper, the army possessed anti-tank defenses. In practice, those defenses depended on time, terrain, and preparation. The three things a surprise encounter did not offer. The anti-tank gun was powerful, but it was also heavy, visible, and slow to redeploy under fire. When tanks found the seams in the line, infantry too often discovered that their anti-tank capability existed somewhere else on the map, and then the requirement sharpened into something unavoidably specific. If heavy armor could arrive without warning, then the answer had to travel with the men themselves. Not a gun that needed a team and a tractor, not a weapon that demanded a perfect firing position. Something closer, something immediate. An infantry weapon that could threaten heavy armor at the range where tanks preferred to kill infantry, close enough for the tank to recognize faces, close enough for the infantry to feel the heat of the engine through the air. It was a grim demand, because it implied what would be asked of the soldier holding it. The weapon would have to be portable, carried through mud, rubble, and exhaustion. It would have to be teachable, because wartime armies did not have the luxury of long apprenticeships. And it would have to be manufacturable under strain, built in quantity, built with materials that were already rationed, built without the delicate workmanship reserved for peacetime perfection. The ideal solution did not matter. Only the solution that could exist in time. Yet inside the institutions that controlled procurement, the requirement collided with pride. Armies do not admit helplessness easily. To concede that infantry needed a new close-range answer to tanks was to admit that earlier answers had failed, or that the enemy had outgrown them. And pride in wartime often wore the uniform of practicality. Doubt was presented as standards. Resistance was dressed up as discipline. The problem was not that commanders did not care. It was that admitting need felt too close to admitting that men had been sent into contact without enough to survive it. But the front did not argue with memos. Out there, where roads narrowed and hedgerows cut sightlines, the stakes were not abstract. They were counted in seconds and bodies. A tank that slipped through could erase a platoon before the battalion knew the fight had begun. A weapon that worked could stop that chain reaction, could prevent casualties that would never appear as a separate statistic, because the men would simply remain alive and therefore uncounted. This was not, in the end, a story about engineering elegance. It was a story about the smallest unit on the battlefield being asked to face the heaviest machine, and the nation behind them realizing, slowly, reluctantly, that courage alone was not a plan. And somewhere far from the street with the waiting tiger, a different kind of battle was unfolding, not against German armor, but against physics, scarcity, and institutional denial, because the next weapon Britain would hand its infantry would need to be effective even if it looked like a mistake. The first time the prototype appeared in front of senior eyes, it did not arrive like a promise. It arrived like an inconvenience. Bulky in the hands, awkward in profile, and stubbornly unmodern, It looked less like a weapon from a mechanized war, and more like something dragged out of a depot where broken tools went to be forgotten. In an age that worshipped sleek lines, aircraft, tanks, artillery pieces shaped by speed and pressure, this thing seemed to belong to an earlier century's logic. Its silhouette alone invited doubt. It was too thick, too blunt, too honest about its own clumsiness. It offered no illusion of elegance. And in wartime, when confidence could be as valuable as steel, appearance mattered more than engineers liked to admit. Men who had spent careers around polished ordnance understood weapons the way they understood uniforms, as symbols of competence. This contraption looked like a question mark. Worse, its principle felt backward. By the early 1940s, the modern imagination was already leaning toward rockets, toward propulsion, range, and the clean idea of a projectile that carried its own power. But this weapon did not announce itself with a sleek tube and a heroic narrative of speed. It relied on a powerful spring, a mechanical act of stored force, a spigot-like launch that seemed almost primitive in a war that had become a contest of engines and electronics. It was not the future people expected. It was a solution that looked at first glance like compromise made physical. The engineers who had built it did not pretend otherwise. They spoke in the language of necessity, not romance. Britain was fighting a war of scarcity as well as strategy. High-grade steel, precision machining time, and complex manufacturing capacity were already spoken for. Aircraft engines, naval guns, tank production. Every elegant weapon demanded materials and labor that could not be conjured out of patriotic speeches. So they designed around what could be spared. A spring could be manufactured without the same drain on strategic resources. A simple launch system could be produced in quantity, repaired in the field, and taught quickly to men who had learned their trade under blackout lamps and accelerated training schedules. And perhaps most importantly, the engineers knew that defeating armor was not only about speed, it was about effect. Concentrated force delivered correctly. They were designing for geometry, not spectacle, an ugly answer to a beautiful problem because the problem was killing men. But when the prototype was presented to generals and procurement boards, it collided with a different kind of logic. It offended the aesthetics of proper weapons. It did not look like the high-minded engineering of empire. It looked like a contrivance. The laughter came easily, not always cruel, but always dismissive. Some of it was genuine skepticism. Some of it was institutional self-defense. To accept such a device was to admit that the Army's existing answers were not enough, that the war had demanded something that did not fit tradition. Mockery made that admission easier to avoid. The inventor, often more a practical mind than a public figure, fought a quiet war of his own. He did not argue in speeches. He argued in numbers, in test firings, in measured penetration results, and controlled demonstrations. Data versus pride. Test results versus laughter. In a laboratory or proving ground, steel did not care about reputation. It either failed or it did not. Yet the men who controlled procurement did care because they were also defending an image of competence. And images are stubborn things. They survive evidence until evidence becomes impossible to ignore. So the weapon acquired a name that matched its character, practical, almost dull. Not a title meant for posters, not a label designed to inspire, a name built for filing cabinets and supply lists, the kind of name given to equipment expected to be used, not celebrated. It was a quiet admission of intent. This was not a symbol. It was a tool. And in that small detail, the irony of the story began to take shape. History rarely begins with something that looks impressive. More often it begins with something that looks wrong. An object mocked for its clumsiness, dismissed for its lack of style, until a battlefield finally asks the only question that matters. Not whether it is elegant, but whether it works. And soon, under the pressure of real armor and real fear, the mistake would be carried out of workshops and into the hands of men who could not afford to care what it looked like, only what it could do. Wartime Britain did not always choose the elegant solution. It chose the available one. By the time heavier German armor began to define the terms of contact, the problem had outgrown speeches and bravado. The question was no longer whether British infantry were willing to fight tanks at close range. They already had, too often, with methods that bordered on ritual. The question was whether the state could put something in their hands that made the fight less like a sacrifice. So a sober philosophy took hold inside procurement offices and trial ranges. Field something workable now, improve it later. That sentence contained the whole atmosphere of the mid-war years, an acceptance that perfection was a luxury, and that delay had its own casualty list. In peacetime, weapons could be refined until they satisfied pride. In wartime, weapons were judged by the men who lived or died using them. The new launcher's purpose was therefore defined narrowly, almost defensively, as if limiting its ambition would protect it from ridicule. It was not meant to be a universal answer to German armor. It was not meant to replace anti-tank guns, artillery, or tanks. It was meant for one harsh circumstance, the close-range encounter where heavy armor appeared before support could be brought to bear. It was a weapon designed for the distances that infantry hated, and tanks preferred. That narrowness was not a weakness. It was honesty. But if the purpose was simple, the handling was not. The weapon's awkward design demanded a kind of learning that could not be improvised in panic. Training doctrine began to form around its clumsiness, shaping men into operators rather than romantics. Procedures replaced feel. Method replaced instinct. The army understood something that is often forgotten in tales of wartime ingenuity. A weapon does not become effective when it is invented. It becomes effective when ordinary soldiers can use it under terror without thinking. So they drilled the sequence, how to carry it without exhaustion destroying aim, how to set up as a team, because weight and bulk punished the solitary man, how to load, cock, and prepare it in the right order, every time, because the mechanism did not forgive improvisation. The launcher was not the kind of tool a soldier could simply figure out. It demanded obedience to steps, and it rewarded those steps with a chance. Safety became an obsession, not because the army suddenly grew cautious, but because spring-driven power behaves like a trap when treated casually. The cocking sequence asked for strength, leverage, attention. Carelessness could mean injury, misfire, wasted ammunition, or worse, a weapon disabled at the moment it was needed most. So discipline hardened around it. Instructors insisted on spacing, backblast awareness, handling rules, and strict roles within the team. They were building not only skill, but a culture of control, because in a close-range anti-tank fight, panic spreads faster than orders. Even as doctrine emerged, skepticism remained. There were officers who predicted embarrassment. They saw the weapon as awkward, too short-ranged, too crude to belong in the modern inventory. Some feared it would encourage false confidence, infantry stepping toward tanks with a belief the launcher could not always justify. Others simply disliked what it represented. An admission that the infantry needed an emergency tool because the system could not always bring heavier guns in time. And yet, advocates predicted something equally plausible: survival. They pointed to trials, to physics, to the simple arithmetic of war. If even a fraction of infantry encounters with armor could be altered, if a tank could be stopped in a village street, held off long enough for artillery to arrive, forced to hesitate, then the weapon would pay for itself in lives not lost. In wartime, both futures existed at once: humiliation if it failed, salvation if it worked. But the weapon's most immediate effect was not measured in penetration charts. It was measured in posture. Infantry who believed they had no answer to heavy armor behaved accordingly. They dispersed too soon, surrendered ground too quickly, broke formation under the spell of invulnerability. Fear did not merely harm morale, it shaped the fight, handing initiative to the tank before the first shot. A portable anti-tank weapon changed that psychology. Even if it was difficult, even if its range was short, it gave men a reason not to run. It replaced helplessness with a task. Get close, get the angle, follow procedure, and make the steel pay attention. That shift mattered because tanks win by forcing hesitation. Now, belief hardened into distribution. The mocked toy moved from proving grounds to depots, from depots to training fields, and from training fields to the front. Crates arrived, manuals were issued, sections were reorganized around the new roles it required. The launcher became issued kit, carried without affection, handled without romance, shouldered with the reluctant respect men reserve for tools that might keep them breathing. And as it entered the hands of soldiers who would soon meet tigers in streets and hedgerows, one unresolved question remained. Would this ungainly device simply give infantry hope? Or would it give them something rarer in war? A way to make a tank hesitate. To the men who first saw it slung over a shoulder or dragged through mud, the launcher looked like an argument made out of iron. But its logic, once explained, was almost disarmingly simple. It was not a rocket weapon. It did not rely on a motor, a burn, or the clean modern idea of propulsion. It relied on stored force, compressed, restrained, and then released in one violent moment. Inside the tube sat a powerful spring, and when the mechanism was cocked, that spring became the heart of the weapon, silent until commanded, then suddenly decisive. The shot itself was brutal in its simplicity. A bomb, large, blunt, and unashamedly heavy, was propelled forward by mechanical energy alone. There was no elegant arc of high velocity, no long-range reach, just a dense projectile hurled with enough force to carry its warhead to the target at the only range that mattered, the range where armor could be touched, measured, and struck with certainty. Because the weapon's killing power did not come from speed, it came from geometry. By this stage of the war, anti-armor warfare had begun to shift away from the older idea that you had to punch through armor with sheer kinetic impact. Shaped charge principles, what engineers would later call the Monroe effect, meant a warhead could defeat thick steel by focusing explosive energy into a narrow jet. In other words, a projectile could arrive slower, even clumsily, and still be lethal, if its design forced energy into the right shape at the right moment. The bomb's job was not to hit like a bullet. Its job was to deliver a carefully arranged violence to a precise patch of steel. But to make that physics useful, the infantryman had to become part of the mechanism. The loading and cocking sequence was not a casual act. It was heavy labor. The gunner worked with the weapon the way a mechanic works with a stubborn machine. Hands braced, body leveraged, attention narrowed. Cocking the spring required strength, technique, and time, and it demanded those things under conditions that rarely offered them. When the launcher was prepared, it did not feel like aiming a gun. It felt like preparing a device that could punish mistakes immediately. That was why training insisted on procedure. The weapon did not forgive improvisation. Its range was honest, and its honesty was frightening. This was not a weapon meant for open fields where a soldier could remain distant and anonymous. Its effective distances were short enough that the tank crew might hear the shot as much as feel it. Short enough that the infantryman could study the enemy's paint, its stowage, the sweep of its turret. It was designed for the distances tanks preferred, because a tank, when confident, closes in. It moves into streets, lanes, and constricted ground where its gun and armor intimidate men into retreat. This launcher was built to function inside that intimidation, not outside it. Accuracy, therefore, became a test of nerve as much as marksmanship. At close range, the enemy was not only steel, but time. A tiger did not sit politely while an infantryman found a comfortable sight picture. The turret rotated. The coaxial machine gun searched. The high-explosive shell waited. The gunner's hands had to do their work, while his mind tried to ignore the most basic instruction of survival: move away. The weapon demanded calm under pressure, because in the seconds required to aim and fire, hesitation became a fatal luxury. And the drawbacks were real, so real that no honest account of the weapon can hide them. It was heavy, awkward to carry on long marches, and exhausting to move into position under fire. The recoil shock could bruise and punish, reminding the gunner that stored force does not vanish, it transfers. The weapon's handling was ungainly in confined spaces, especially when adrenaline narrowed fine motor control into something crude. In wet weather, dirt and neglect could turn mechanics into failure, and every soldier who trained on it understood the quiet truth. This was a weapon that demanded a team not because doctrine enjoyed complexity, but because reality required it. Yet the paradox was what made it important: miserable to carry, difficult to master, unforgiving of carelessness, and still terrifying to the armor it could reach. Because once the spring released, once the heavy bomb left the spigot and struck at the right angle, the laws that protected tanks began to change. Thick armor plates and proud reputations could not negotiate with shaped explosive force. They could only endure it, or fail. And soon, on real roads under real winter light, infantry would discover whether this clumsy mechanism was merely another desperate idea, or the first portable tool that could make a tiger feel, for the first time, something close to doubt. To understand why the tiger could sit at the end of a street like a verdict, it helps to see it not as a single machine, but as a system. The tank was steel, yes, but it was also optics, crew routine, radio discipline, and a reputation that arrived before the vehicle did. By 1943 and 1944, the Tiger had become more than a piece of hardware. It was a psychological event, and like most events in war, it was composed of many parts working together toward one outcome: dominance. Its armor was the most visible component of that dominance: thick plates, carefully angled surfaces, a frontal profile designed to absorb punishment without yielding. But armor alone does not create a myth. The Tiger also carried fine optics for its era, giving its crew the ability to see, identify, and engage targets at ranges where infantry felt like exposed biology. A Tiger did not need to guess where danger might be. It could often locate it before the danger understood it had been seen. Then there was the crew itself, men trained to make the machine behave like a single organism. A tank is not lethal because it has a gun. It is lethal because the gun, the loader, the commander, the driver, and the radio operator work with practiced rhythm. In well-drilled crews, movement and firing become a routine rather than a drama. The Tiger's reputation was not built only on thickness of steel, but on the calm efficiency of the men inside it. And that calm created its most subtle weapon: intimidation. The Tiger changed infantry behavior before it ever fired. A tank's mere appearance forced men to reconsider the meaning of cover, the value of movement, the wisdom of staying together. Infantry units that might have advanced confidently against machine gun nests suddenly became cautious, then fragmented, then passive. This was not cowardice. It was calculation under threat. The tank's presence threatened to end lives so quickly that decision-making narrowed into survival reflex. Fear, in that context, became a tactical advantage. Not an accident, not a side effect, a deliberate component of how heavy armor shaped the battlefield. German crews understood this. They trusted their armor to buy time. Seconds, half minutes, full minutes of seeming invulnerability while the enemy struggled to find an angle. And time, in armored warfare, is currency. Time allows a tank to choose its targets, to coordinate with supporting infantry, to call artillery, to reposition, to dominate. The Tiger was engineered not only to withstand hits, but to remain confident long enough to dictate the tempo of the encounter. That confidence could harden into something close to arrogance, not the emotional arrogance of a man, but the engineered arrogance of a weapon designed to survive. Nowhere was that more visible than in the turret's motion. When the Tiger's turret rotated, it often did so slowly. Not because it was hurried or confused, but because it did not need to rush. It turned with the assurance of something that believed it was protected by both physics and myth. In tight terrain, streets, lanes, village squares, that motion became a psychological weapon. The barrel swept across hiding places with the patience of a searchlight. It dared men to expose themselves. It forced them to imagine the moment of impact before the shell arrived. Infantry learned a cruel truth in those moments. The tank wins by making you hesitate. Hesitation breaks cohesion. It delays ambushes. It ruins timing. It makes a soldier wait a fraction too long to move, and that fraction becomes fatal. Tanks are not only killers, they are creators of delay. They turn decision-making into panic, and panic into disorder. And once disorder spreads, even the best infantry weapons become irrelevant because they are never brought to bear in time. That is how a myth forms. The Tiger's invulnerability was not absolute. Like all machines, it had weaknesses: flanks, rear armor, vulnerabilities at close range, the limitations of its own weight and size. But facts travel slowly in war. Myths travel fast because they are easier to remember. A single story of a tiger shrugging off fire could outweigh a dozen quieter accounts of tigers destroyed, simply because fear edits memory more efficiently than reason. So the myth spread ahead of the vehicle. Tigers cannot be stopped. Tigers absorb everything. Tigers decide the fight. And once that belief took root, it shaped behavior in ways that made it partially true. Men ran sooner. Guns were abandoned rather than repositioned. Ambushes were not attempted. The tiger's psychological armor became as valuable as its steel. But myths, once believed, invite the very weapon that exists to destroy them. Because when the battlefield creates an illusion of invincibility, someone will eventually build a tool whose sole purpose is to prove that illusion wrong. And in the quiet space between a turret's slow rotation and an infantryman's steady hands, the war was about to test which belief would survive: the tiger's confidence, or the spring toy designed to puncture it. Training with the new launcher did not begin with confidence. It began with a controlled form of fear. Instructors understood that the weapon's greatest obstacle was not mechanical, it was human. Every instinct in an infantryman, honed by survival and reinforced by experience, told him to increase distance from a tank. Tanks were machines built to kill at close range, and the closer you stood to one, the more the world seemed to narrow into a single outcome. Yet this weapon demanded the opposite. It required men to move toward the threat, deliberately, under pressure, and without the comfort of certainty. So training fields became laboratories for courage that could be repeated. The first lessons were not about firing. They were about movement, how to approach without being seen, how to use rubble, hedges, ditches, walls, any interruption in the enemy's line of sight, as if it were a second uniform. Men were taught to crawl when standing felt faster, to wait when moving felt urgent, to accept that time could be either a weapon or a trap. Controlled fear meant teaching soldiers to act while their bodies argued against them. Teams rehearsed the hunt as a set of rehearsed permissions: concealment first, timing second, and above all, the discipline of waiting. A tank could be killed by one well-placed shot. It could also kill an entire section in the moment impatience broke cover. Instructors repeated the same truth until it became tedious, because tedium was the goal. If procedure could be made boring in training, it might remain intact in battle. The gunner's relationship with the launcher was forged through repetition that bordered on ritual. The cocking routine was labor: hands, leverage, braced posture, breath held at the right time. And because it was labor, it could be disrupted by panic. In early drills, men fumbled, rushed, forgot steps, fought the mechanism instead of working with it. Instructors did not shout for drama. They corrected with the calm of men who knew the consequence of a mistake. Again. Slower. Again. Correctly. Again. Until the body learned the sequence even while the mind was occupied with fear. This was the quiet transformation the army needed. Turning a man into an extension of a machine without stripping away his judgment. The weapon's weight forced an honesty about teamwork. One man could fire it, but no man could treat it as a personal weapon the way he treated a rifle. The launcher demanded a small system of its own. A carrier to bring it forward without exhausting the gunner before the fight began. A spotter to watch the tank's movement, to read the turret's intention, to measure distance and angle in seconds. A protector to watch for enemy infantry, because tanks rarely traveled alone, and a man focused on steel could be killed by flesh. Roles were assigned not for tradition, but for survival. The anti-tank team became a distinct organism inside the platoon, moving differently, thinking differently, carrying a different kind of burden. Their world was geometry and timing, not volume of fire. And doctrine evolved accordingly. In classrooms and muddy fields, instructors drew lines and angles in the dirt. They spoke of flanks and blind zones, of where armor was thickest and where it thinned. They taught men to think in escape paths, because firing was only half the problem. Getting away after firing mattered just as much. A tank that survived a first hit could answer with a shell that erased walls and bodies alike. Even a tank that was damaged could still kill, still crush, still call in help. Doctrine therefore treated the shot as the beginning of a dangerous sequence, not the end of one. Men learned to plan their approach like engineers. Not heroic charges, but measured routes. Not bravery, but angles. The launcher's short range forced this discipline because it required proximity without allowing recklessness. Close-range anti-tank fighting was a profession of moments. Moments spent invisible, moments spent moving, and a single moment spent exposed. Every few paragraphs of instruction came a new tension, because the instructors had to confront the truth their students already sensed. The team might do everything correctly and still fail. A bad angle, a misfire, a round that struck the wrong surface, a tank escorted by alert infantry. War did not guarantee fairness. It only rewarded preparation more often than it punished it. That is why innovation in this story was never just a breakthrough in a workshop. It was a chain of survivable habits. A weapon could be issued in crates, but effectiveness had to be built into muscles and reflexes. It had to be drilled into hands that would shake when the turret turned. The army was not merely teaching men how to fire a launcher. It was teaching them how to inhabit fear without surrendering to it, how to let terror exist and still complete the sequence. And gradually, almost without announcement, the laughter began to fade. The spring toy stopped being funny the first time a soldier realized what it represented. Not a gimmick, not a clever invention, but a sentence he might pass on a tank when everything else had failed him. In that realization, the weapon became heavy in a new way, not just physically, but morally, because if it worked, it required men to step into the distance where tanks killed best. And the battlefield was waiting to see whether those drilled habits would hold when the target was real steel, real fire, and real seconds. Because training can control fear, but only combat can prove what fear will allow. The proving ground is polite, it offers clear targets, measured distances, and the illusion that stress can be scheduled. The battlefield offers none of that. It introduces weapons the way it introduces everything else, suddenly, without warning, and at the worst possible moment. For the new launcher, the first real proof did not come when the army was ready to demonstrate it. It came when a tiger appeared where it should not have been, in terrain that turned doctrine into a wish. It emerged in broken country, ragged slopes, shattered stonework, narrow lanes cut by rubble and hedges, places where heavy support could not be brought up quickly, and where anti-tank guns could not be laid calmly into position. The Tiger's engine note was low and steady, a sound that made men look at one another without speaking. Tanks in open ground were frightening. Tanks in confined ground were intimate. You could hear them breathe. Infantry reacted as infantry often did under sudden armored pressure. They dispersed, not out of cowardice, but because every lesson of survival urged them to stop being a cluster that a single shell could erase. Men took cover in doorways, ditches, behind walls that had already been struck once and might not endure a second time. The unit's cohesion, its ability to act together, became the only armor it truly possessed. If they scattered into individuals, the tiger would pick them off. If they stayed connected, they might still shape the fight. The tank began to fire, not wildly, but with the detached efficiency of a crew that understood the mathematics of panic. A burst of machine gun fire stitched across stone and earth. A high-explosive shell struck a wall and turned it into fragments. The point was not only to kill, the point was to break timing, to force movement, to make every action feel premature. The Tiger's gun did not just remove bodies, it removed plans. And yet amid the chaos, the anti-tank team began to work. They did not sprint forward like a storybook charge. They moved with the stubborn caution drilled into them. The weapon was heavy, and haste made mistakes. They understood, as every trained team understood, that the tank's advantage was distance and sight lines, and that both could be stolen. Smoke was used not as decoration, but as theft, stealing the Tiger's attention, stealing its certainty, stealing seconds from steel. A smoke grenade hissed and began to bloom. Dust rose where rounds struck. The air thickened into partial blindness, and in that blindness, the infantry found a narrow breathing space. The spotter watched the turret's movement through gaps in the haze. The protector watched for enemy infantry, because the most dangerous moment for an anti-tank gunner was not firing at a tank. It was being shot by a rifleman while he did it. The gunner crawled. He crawled because distance was the enemy's advantage, and because upright men are easy to track. He crawled with the launcher's weight dragging at his shoulders and the cocking mechanism pressing into him like a reminder of what had to be done. He could feel the tank's presence through vibration, through the way the ground seemed to carry the engine's rhythm into his bones. This was the kind of proximity that made the mind argue with itself, every nerve shouting that closeness meant death. But training had taught him something harsher. Closeness was also opportunity. He reached a position that was not comfortable, only usable. A pocket of cover that offered a line to the tank's flank as it angled past rubble. His hands worked through the sequence with a concentration that felt almost separate from him. Cock, load, set. The weapon did not become lighter. Fear did not become smaller. But procedure held both at bay. The Tiger's turret shifted. It moved with that same slow, assured rotation, searching for movement, searching for a mistake. The tank believed it had time. It believed the infantry would break first. That belief was the Tiger's true armor. It was why the crew could afford calm. And then the gunner rose just enough to fire. He shouldered the awkward launcher, feeling recoil and fear as one physical thing, two forces waiting to be released. The sight picture was short, crude, almost insulting compared to the tank's optics. But the gunner did not need elegance. He needed alignment. He needed the decisive angle, the place where armor was thinnest, where confidence became vulnerability. The shot cracked outward with a blunt finality. For a fraction of a second, nothing changed, and that fraction felt like the old world reasserting itself. Then the impact registered. The bomb struck at the angle doctrine had begged for. Smoke and dust spurted from the point of contact. The Tiger's body, so composed, so confident, gave a small, unmistakable sign of harm. Not cinematic explosion, not instant destruction, just the sudden behavior of something mortal. The crew's rhythm faltered. The turret paused. The machine that had been imposing tempo now had to react. And that was the revelation, landing quietly in the minds of everyone watching. The battlefield does not reward elegance. It rewards what works at the distance reality demands. A weapon mocked for its ugliness had just forced the most feared tank in the German arsenal to reconsider the terms of the fight. But proof creates a new problem. Once word spreads that infantry can stop heavy armor up close, the enemy adapts, and so must the men carrying the launcher. Because the next time a Tiger appears, it will not arrive with the same casual confidence. And the spring toy team will have to decide whether one success was an exception or the beginning of a new rule. News of a weapon's first success rarely travels as a clean story. It moves through the army the way smoke moves through ruins, unevenly, carried by rumor, shaped by fear, and thickened by exaggeration. Reports began to circulate from units that had met German armor at close range and survived. Some praised the launcher with the relief of men who had watched steel pause for the first time. Others wrote with caution, listing bruises, misfires, and the punishing shock that traveled through a gunner's body when the spring released. The weapon's reputation formed in fragments, part miracle, part menace, part hard-earned practicality. Commanders reading those reports confronted an old wartime rule that never changed, no matter how modern the technology became. Imperfect weapons require perfect drills. A weapon that was heavy, awkward, and short-ranged could not be treated like a casual addition to the kit. It demanded discipline, rehearsal, and an acceptance that success would depend less on heroism than on repetition. The launcher's power was real, but so were its conditions. It did not forgive sloppiness. It did not reward improvisation. It punished the man who believed good enough was good enough. So units began to standardize it, not in theory, but in habit. Platoons quietly reorganized around the launcher's needs. The weapon ceased to be an object and became a system. A spotter was assigned, not as an optional helper, but as a necessary pair of eyes, watching the tank's movement, reading its turret, measuring the approach route, calling the moment to fire. A carrier was designated, because exhaustion could ruin a gunner long before the engagement began. A coverman stayed close, because anti-tank work was never conducted against tanks alone. Enemy infantry lurked in the same ground, waiting for the moment the gunner's attention narrowed into tunnel vision. These roles did not make the weapon glamorous. They made it reliable. And reliability was the only kind of praise that mattered. Within this new system, a subtle lesson emerged, one that separated surviving units from those that merely hoped. A gunner learned to trust procedure more than confidence, because confidence lies. Confidence tells a man he can rush the cocking sequence under fire. It tells him he can expose himself an extra second for a better view. It tells him the tank will behave as expected. Procedure tells him something colder and more useful, that the enemy does not care what he believes, only what he does, and whether he does it correctly. In the moments before contact, this difference became everything. A gunner would feel his hands tremble, not from weakness, but from the body's honest recognition of danger. The launcher's metal would be cold against his palms. The sound of tracks would vibrate in his chest, and in that moment, confidence could evaporate like breath in winter air. Procedure remained, step by step, cock, load, align, breathe, fire, move. It was the opposite of romantic heroism. It was survival turned into choreography. As the launcher entered routine service, maintenance stopped being an afterthought and became ritual. The spring was not treated like a component. It was treated like life support. The sights were checked and rechecked because a slight misalignment at close range meant more than a miss. It meant wasted seconds, wasted ammunition, and a tank that now knew you were there. Crews wiped grime from moving parts with the care of men cleaning an instrument that could keep their friends alive. They protected rounds as if each were a sealed argument, because ammunition was not infinite and close-range opportunities were rare. In field conditions, the weapon's weaknesses were never theoretical. Mud worked into mechanisms. Improper storage dulled reliability. Fatigue tempted shortcuts. So ritual became insurance. A team that maintained the launcher well did not do so out of affection. It did so out of self-respect and a blunt awareness that carelessness would not be forgiven. The weapon's reputation changed slowly, as most reputations in war do. One successful engagement could be dismissed as luck. Two could be called coincidence, but repeated proof, paid for in close calls, bruised shoulders, misfires narrowly corrected, tanks halted at the last possible moment, began to accumulate a different kind of authority. Reports became less excited and more matter-of-fact. The language of myth gave way to the language of procedure. Commanders stopped asking whether the weapon could work and began asking whether their men were trained to make it work. In that shift, the spring toy crossed an invisible threshold. It was not admired. It was not loved. It did not inspire the aesthetic pride that came with sleek weapons and clean design. It remained awkward, heavy, and punishing. But it earned something rarer than admiration. It was taken seriously, not as a gimmick, not as a symbol, not as a hopeful experiment, but as a tool that could impose caution on heavy armor. And once a tank begins to fear infantry at close range, the battlefield changes in ways that ripple outward. The next step was not merely learning to use the launcher, it was learning how that launcher could rewrite the close fight rules entirely, forcing German crews to adapt, forcing villages and narrow ground to become traps instead of stages. Because the toy was no longer a joke told behind headquarters lines. It was now a problem the enemy had to solve. At first, the launcher had been treated like a novelty, an awkward addition to kit, carried because orders demanded it, doubted because its shape offended professional instinct. But war is an unforgiving editor. It removes what is useless and preserves what keeps men alive. As reports accumulated and engagements repeated themselves across villages, hedgerows, and broken roads, the weapon shifted categories. It stopped being a perhaps. It became an expectation. And with that shift, tanks could no longer enter close terrain, assuming infantry were merely targets. That single change altered the psychological balance of the battlefield. In constricted ground, where stone walls narrowed lines of sight and rubble turned movement into funnels, heavy armor had once owned the fight by default. It could roll forward, confident that infantry lacked a portable answer capable of threatening thick armor quickly. The tank's dominance was not only about firepower, it was about the freedom to dictate distance. A tank that could keep infantry pinned at rifle range could kill with patience. But now, the assumption began to fracture. In village streets and lanes, a crew had to consider the possibility that somewhere within 50 yards, a team might be waiting with a method and a heavy bomb. This did not make the tank weak. It made the tank cautious, and caution is expensive. Anti-tank teams began to think less like riflemen and more like engineers. Their world became lines and angles rather than slogans. They mapped cover arcs the way artillerymen mapped fire missions. They studied engagement windows, those brief moments when a tank's movement exposed a flank, when a turret faced away, when the crew's attention narrowed onto the wrong threat. They measured terrain not by how it felt under boots, but by what it allowed a tank to see and what it forced a tank to ignore. A corner became an opportunity. A doorway became concealment. A ditch became a firing position, not because it was comfortable, but because it shaped geometry in their favor. This was the turning point. Infantry learning to impose structure on fear. The weapon's short range, once considered its flaw, became its discipline. It forced teams to plan approach routes and escape paths. It made them treat patience as a form of firepower. It taught them that the tank's true advantage was not armor thickness alone, but the ability to make men rush, scatter, and reveal themselves. When infantry refused that impulse, when they held still and allowed the tank to commit itself, the balance began to tilt. German crews adapted, as professional soldiers always do. The Tiger and other heavy armor did not cease to be lethal. Instead, their behavior changed. Tanks began to use more standoff fire, trying to break suspected ambush sites from a distance rather than rolling into them with casual confidence. Escort infantry became more important because close-range threats could not always be spotted through optics alone. In villages, tanks moved with more hesitation, pausing, reversing, waiting for infantry screens to probe corners that armor could not safely test. The tank was still dominant, but dominance now required extra steps, extra resources, extra time. And time, again, was currency. The audience can see the pivot clearly here. The tank remains powerful, but it no longer enjoys cheap power. Every advance into constricted terrain now carries an added risk that cannot be solved purely by thicker steel. The tank must pay for its movement with caution, with supporting troops, with shells fired into empty doorways just in case. The very presence of a portable anti-tank answer forces the armored crew to spend effort on uncertainty. A micro moment captures it. A British anti-tank team lies in a ditch outside a village lane. They have been there long enough for their muscles to ache and their breathing to quiet. The launcher rests close, heavy and unlovely. The gunner's cheek presses into damp earth. The spotter watches a gap between walls. No one speaks, because speech is wasted movement. They can hear the tank before they see it, tracks biting into stone, engine note rising and falling as the driver adjusts. Then the Tiger appears, inching forward, not charging, not triumphant. It advances with a wary rhythm, turret scanning, coaxial gun twitching as if the machine itself has learned suspicion. The tank is still terrifying, but the terror is no longer one-sided. The team does not move. They let the tank come into their geometry. Seconds pass. The turret turns away. The flank edges into view. The spotter's hand touches the gunner's arm. No words, just a signal that training has made universal. The gunner's hands find the familiar sequence, not with confidence, but with obedience. The weapon is cocked. The bomb is set. The sight picture forms. And in that silent pause, the war's logic becomes visible. Steel remains powerful, until it must fear a man in a ditch. That fear does not destroy the tank's dominance overnight, but it bends it. It forces armor to behave differently, to fight differently, to pay more for every street and every lane. And the more expensive dominance becomes, the more opportunities open for infantry, artillery, and air power to exploit hesitation. Because once a Tiger begins to move, as though something might be waiting for it, the myth has already begun to die. And soon, in a narrow street of stone walls and trapped men, that dying myth will meet the moment it cannot survive. A single shot, delivered where doctrine and patience say it must be, ending laughter not through drama, but through physics. We return to the street in Italy, where stone walls compress the world into a narrow corridor. At the far end sits a Tiger tank, engine idling, gun steady, blocking the road with unhurried authority. Dust hangs in the air, stirred by earlier impacts. The infantry clings to doorways and rubble, knowing the street offers no retreat. Seconds stretch. The Tiger waits. It has learned that time itself is a weapon. It does not advance. It does not rush. Its confidence is mechanical, built from armor, optics, and drill. The gun covers the length of the street, denying movement by implication alone. Every moment the tank remains still tightens pressure on the men watching it. If nothing changes, German support will arrive. If someone moves, the Tiger will answer. The anti-tank team moves without drama. There are no gestures of bravery, only practiced restraint. Each step is small, deliberate, learned from earlier losses. Metal is kept from scraping stone, breathing is slowed. The spotter watches the turret, measuring its rhythm. The coverman scans for infantry. This is not heroism. It is survival organized into method. The gunner accepts the launcher and feels its weight settle into his body. It is heavier than a rifle, heavier than fear. Cocking the mechanism requires strength and attention. He works the sequence exactly as taught, because precision is the only protection available. The weapon offers no comfort, it offers a single chance. Down the street, the turret turns, slow and deliberate, searching for movement. The barrel passes windows and doorways as if testing them. The tiger believes hesitation will expose its enemy. That belief has protected it before. It has learned that infantry usually breaks first. The team waits. They allow the tank to commit itself. Doctrine has taught them patience is a weapon. The distance closes not by movement, but by time. A slight shift in the hull exposes a fraction of flank. The turret turns away. The moment opens. The spotter touches the gunner's arm. No words are needed. The launcher rises. The gunner aligns the sight on a specific plate of armor, not the tank as a whole. He is not calm. He is focused. Focus replaces fear long enough to act. The shot breaks outward with blunt force. There is no spectacle, only impact. The bomb strikes at the chosen angle. For a heartbeat, the tiger remains unchanged. Then smoke erupts from the contact point. The tank shudders. Its certainty falters. Inside the tank, confidence collapses into confinement. Steel that promised safety becomes a sealed space filled with noise and shock. The crew reacts instead of commanding. The tiger is no longer dictating tempo. It is responding. The infantry does not celebrate. They move immediately, because training demands it. They know survival requires distance after contact. But something irreversible has occurred. The myth surrounding the tiger has been pierced. Armor has been forced to acknowledge vulnerability. This is the moment the laughter dies. The weapon once dismissed has delivered a verdict without drama or mercy. It has done exactly what it was built to do. In war, that is enough. The street remains dangerous. German infantry may still advance. Another shell may arrive. But the balance has shifted in a way that cannot be reversed. Infantry has proven it can reach heavy armor with disciplined proximity. A machine designed to inspire paralysis has been forced to hesitate. That hesitation will echo beyond this street. It will travel through reports, training manuals, and enemy briefings. Tanks will approach villages differently. Infantry will hold ground longer. The battlefield will remember this exchange long after the smoke clears. One mocked launcher has altered the logic of close combat, not through elegance, but through function, not through speed, but through placement. Steel remains powerful, but it is no longer absolute. And as the team withdraws into cover, the meaning settles quietly. The joke has ended because belief has ended. A tiger has been proven mortal at close range. From this moment forward, every tank entering a narrow street will carry that knowledge with it, whether its crew chooses to acknowledge it or not. Again and again, across the war, from now on, after the street fight, no one spoke of luck. They spoke of angles. In battalion notes and after-action reports, the same details returned. Where the tank appeared, how long the turret searched, which wall hid the team, which plate finally failed. What worked began to harden into policy. Ambush geometry was sketched on maps, then copied into training pamphlets. Team roles were formalized, not as improvisation, but as doctrine: carrier, spotter, coverman, gunner. Strict firing discipline followed, because one careless shot could waste the only chance. So commanders demanded rehearsals until movements became automatic and repeatable under fire. Senior officers also learned where the launcher belonged and where it did not. It was not a field gun and could not dominate open country. Its honest range made it a village weapon, a hedge weapon, a corner weapon. In close, constricted terrain, tanks could not keep distance, and distance was the tiger's oldest ally. Here the infantry could borrow the walls, the rubble, the bends in the road. Commanders began to place anti-tank teams where armor must slow. Crossroads, narrow bridges, orchard lanes, street mouths. They did not promise victory, the chance to stop a push in time. Redundancy followed, because war punishes single points of failure. Extra teams were assigned when weapons allowed, and contingencies were rehearsed like prayers said without faith. If the first shot missed, a second position was prepared. If the gunner fell, another man knew the sequence. Rounds were scarce, so allocation became controlled, carried forward only when armor was likely, guarded like rations, logged like medicine. Units learned to coordinate smoke, diversion fire, and movement, so the launcher was never exposed alone. A contraption survived by being surrounded with planning. This was how fear became organized, and organization became the infantry's shield. One morning, before an expected advance, a gunner kneels in a shell crater and checks the mechanism with careful hands. He does not believe in luck anymore. He wipes grit from the spigot, tests the safety catch, listens for the spring's proper tension, and sights along the crude aiming marks as if they were instruments. Around him, men eat cold food and pretend not to watch. The ritual is quiet, almost domestic, yet it carries the weight of an argument. If the launcher fails, the tank will not forgive. He rises slowly, knowing procedure is the only mercy war offers. From such moments, a systemic truth became visible. Effectiveness often comes from procedure more than invention. The spring, the bomb, the tube were necessary, but not sufficient. What stopped tanks was the choreography built around them: who watched, who carried, who protected, who decided when to fire. Armies like to celebrate breakthroughs, yet most battlefield change arrives as standardization. A weapon becomes dangerous when it is predictable in friendly hands and surprising in enemy eyes. Manuals, drills, and inspections did as much work as metallurgy. In that sense, doctrine was the spring, storing discipline until the moment it had to release. The launcher also found its place inside combined arms rather than above it. It did not replace artillery, tanks, or air power, and no honest commander pretended it could. Instead, it bought time, stalled movement, forced armor to button up, and exposed tanks to other killers. A halted Tiger could be bracketed by mortars, struck by guns brought forward, or attacked by aircraft when weather allowed. The infantry weapon was a thread, not a miracle. One strand woven into a larger net that caught steel. That humility mattered, because miracles invite disappointment, but tools invite repetition, and repetition wins campaigns eventually. The turning point settled in the minds of men at platoon level. Infantry was no longer helpless by definition, only by circumstance. The wrong ground, the wrong timing, the wrong support. Given training, concealment, and a narrow street, they could impose doubt on steel. Yet the cost remained intimate. To stop a tank, you still had to approach it, listen to its engine, feel its turret searching for you. The weapon changed possibility, not nature. And as veterans would later admit, the new doctrine saved lives by asking for nerve in measured doses. But it also changed what it cost. Hunting tanks was not like trading fire with unseen rifles. It was intimate fear performed in public, in full view of men who could not help you. When the order came to move a launcher forward, everyone watched the same body language: shoulders tightening, mouths going dry, eyes measuring a street or a hedge gap as if it were a doorway into a furnace. A tank did not need to kill you to change you. It only had to make you imagine what it would feel like. Veterans remembered the soundscape more than the shapes. Tracks on stone had a slow, crushing rhythm. Engines idled like restrained animals. Turret motors whined with a mechanical patience that turned seconds into something audible. In close country, you could hear the gun traverse before you could see it, and that sound became a clock. A pause meant the commander was looking. A longer pause meant he had found something. Men learned to read noise the way sailors read wind. The moral weight arrived in small choices: when to fire, when to hold, when to let the tank pass so a flank would show, when to risk a second shot after the first had already revealed your position. None of those decisions felt heroic in the moment. They felt like accounting. A gunner judged distance, angle, and the life expectancy of his own body. A spotter decided whether a teammate's courage was discipline or impatience. War asked them to be cold for a few seconds, so others could remain alive for months. Medics saw the hidden arithmetic. They rarely celebrated a tank destroyed, yet they noticed the absence that followed. Fewer shattered limbs from high explosive, fewer men pulled from collapsed rooms, fewer stretches of stretcher work under machine gun fire. Every tank stopped early prevented casualties that would never be tallied as saved. Those numbers stayed invisible because survival leaves no record as dramatic as death. In field dressing stations, the value of an anti-tank team was measured in quiet nights and shorter lists. Over time, fear did not vanish. It changed shape. It became disciplined dread, routine, controlled, and exhausting. Men learned to breathe through the approach, to keep hands steady through the cocking sequence, to accept that their heartbeat would always be loud at close range. After an engagement, some shook, some went silent, some joked too sharply. But the next day, the same men checked springs, cleaned sights, and rehearsed routes, because the body can be taught to work even when the mind refuses comfort. The weapon's truth was always balanced. It was powerful enough to humble steel, yet awkward enough to bruise the shoulder and punish a careless stance. It could misfire, it could jam, it could demand strength at the worst moment, and still, when it worked, it could save an entire section, turning a street from a trap into a passage, turning a village from a grave into a position held. Infantry respected it the way miners respect a fragile lamp, not because it is pleasant, but because darkness is worse. That was the hard irony. Innovation that protected infantry also forced infantry closer to the sharpest edge of war. The launcher reduced helplessness, but it did so by asking men to approach the very machine built to erase them. It made survival possible, yet it made survival personal. In later years, many could describe the first time they heard a turret searching for them in the dark, and how they realized they were no longer merely enduring the war. They were stepping into it, deliberately. After victory, the weapon sat in stores and museums, but the sensation remained in the men. Some spoke of the tiger as a sound before it was a shape, a presence that rewired their instincts. Others remembered the strange relief of having an answer, even a crude one, and the shame of needing it. The launcher did not make them fearless. It made them functional. And that distinction would shape the post-war search for better infantry answers to armor in the decades that followed the war. After the war, armies studied their victories with the same seriousness they once studied their defeats. They had watched armor dominate when infantry lacked portable answers, and they had watched that dominance become more cautious once those answers appeared. The lesson was not subtle. Post-war planners absorbed it with the quiet clarity that only mass experience can produce. Infantry needs a way to threaten armor on its own terms, even if the solution is imperfect, even if it looks crude, even if it demands uncomfortable proximity. Without that, a platoon becomes a spectator to steel. In this sense, the mocked launcher sat on an evolutionary bridge. It belonged neither to the old world of anti-tank rifles and field guns, nor fully to the coming age of sleek, purpose-built rocket systems. Its logic was transitional. It still felt mechanical, still rooted in stored force and close-range geometry, yet its warhead principles pointed forward toward shaped-charge anti-armor thinking that would define the decades to come. It was a hinge between eras. 1 foot in the gun age, 1 foot stepping into the infantry missile age. That is why engineers argued about what had mattered most. Some insisted the mechanism itself was the breakthrough: simple manufacture, fewer scarce resources, a way to distribute anti-armor capability rapidly under strain. Others argued the warhead was the true story, the focused effect that allowed thick armor to be defeated without high velocity. And a third group, often veterans and trainers, suggested the most important element had been neither spring nor explosive, but doctrine, the drills, the team roles, the geometry that turned a difficult device into a repeatable act under fear. In their view, the weapon's legacy was procedural, proof that a tool becomes powerful only when an army can make ordinary men use it correctly in extraordinary moments. Years later, a veteran handles the launcher again in a depot or museum. It is heavier than memory allows, metal cold even in clean air. He lifts it and feels the old strain in the shoulder, the awkward balance, the way the device demands both hands and attention. The weight is not only physical, it carries the remembered sound of tracks and the remembered discipline of waiting. It carries the memory of lying still while steel searched for you. In that moment, he does not think about engineering debates. He thinks about distance, the uncomfortable distance where survival depended on procedure and nerve. And yet the wider world does not remember it that way. The tank myth survives in films and popular histories because it is simple and visually satisfying. A tiger looks like power. Its silhouette explains itself. The infantry counter myth is quieter, less cinematic, and therefore less often told. Men with an ugly launcher in a ditch, waiting for the right angle, winning not with spectacle, but with method. The public imagination prefers armored duels, not the slow mathematics of ambush. It remembers the machine more easily than the men who learned how to make the machine hesitate. But the truer lesson often lives in the quieter story. The audience, looking back, confronts a larger truth about progress. It is often born from compromise and urgency. The launcher was not a perfect design. It arrived with flaws and limitations written into its shape. It demanded closeness. It punished mistakes. It offended professional taste. Yet it existed at the moment it was needed, and it did a job that had become essential. That is how wartime innovation frequently works. It does not emerge as graceful solution. It emerges as workable answer, then grows into doctrine, then becomes a stepping stone for better systems. In the years that followed, armies built lighter, longer-ranged, more reliable infantry anti-armor weapons. Rockets became practical, guidance improved, training matured, but the intellectual foundation remained. Armor must never be allowed to feel immortal in the presence of infantry. Once infantry can impose risk on steel, armor must behave differently, more cautious, more dependent on combined arms, more expensive in its movement. That was the real inheritance of the spring toy, passed forward into later decades in the shape of new weapons and new tactics. So legacy must be framed honestly. Innovation is real even when it arrives without grace. It may look awkward in the moment, and it may be mocked by those who value aesthetics over necessity. But war does not reward beauty. It rewards function, delivered at the decisive distance, by men trained to act when instinct insists they should flee. And long after the laughter faded, the lesson remained. The most important weapon is often the one that forces the enemy to doubt. We return, finally, to the laughter. Not the laughter of victory, but the earlier kind. The short, dismissive sound men make when a new weapon looks wrong in their hands. In wartime headquarters and training fields, mockery often served a practical purpose. It was armor for the ego under uncertainty. If you could laugh at a contraption, you did not have to admit how much you needed it. If you could call it a toy, you could pretend the enemy's steel was not rewriting the rules faster than your institutions could respond. That laughter was never purely cruelty. It was self-protection. It was the sound of pride trying to remain intact while the war stripped old assumptions away. But the story, when seen clearly, does not belong to ridicule or romance. It belongs to timing, training, and the willingness to approach fear with method. The launcher did not work because it was magical. It worked because it arrived at the moment infantry needed a portable answer and because an army built drills around its limitations. It worked because men practiced the cocking sequence until panic could not interrupt it, because teams learned geometry until distance stopped being a mystery, and because spotters and carriers and covermen turned a clumsy device into a system. In war, tools become decisive only when ordinary men can use them under extraordinary pressure. The tiger, too, must be reinterpreted. It was not defeated by trickery, nor by sudden weakness, nor by some mythic reversal of fortune. It was defeated in the only way armored dominance can be defeated, by certainty collapsing at close range. A tiger was strong because it made infantry hesitate. It was strong because its reputation arrived first. It was strong because it could buy time, and time bought control. But close ground compresses time. Streets shorten choices. Walls deny maneuver. And when infantry learned to wait, to let the tank commit, to strike at the decisive angle, the tiger's greatest protection, belief, became vulnerable. This is the paradox the war forced into existence. The conflict demanded heavy tanks, machines built to survive, to intimidate, to punch through prepared defenses. Yet the same conflict demanded humble tools to kill them. Not always glamorous, not always elegant, sometimes uncomfortable to admit. That is how modern war behaves. It creates extraordinary weapons and then creates desperate instruments to negate them. Progress does not move in a straight line. It moves in contest, each invention dragging a counter-invention behind it. So the spring toy becomes a symbol of wartime reality. Beauty matters less than function at decisive distance. A weapon can look ridiculous and still hold the power to change behavior across a front. The men who mocked it were not fools. They were human beings shaped by tradition. But war does not care for tradition. It cares only for outcomes. The battlefield is the harshest committee in history, and it approves only what works. In the final image, there is no celebration. Infantry walk past a silent tank on a narrow road. The steel sits dead and empty, smoke staining its surfaces, tracks still. Men do not gather for photographs. They do not cheer. They step around the wreck the way men step around an animal that has stopped moving, carefully, with a quiet respect for what it once was. Survival is not theatrical. It is administrative. It is the next task, the next corner, the next road that must be held. Somewhere among them is the gunner who carried the awkward launcher. He does not look triumphant. He looks tired, because close anti-tank war does not grant joy, only continuation. The weapon hangs heavy again, no lighter for having proved itself. In that weight is the truth of the whole story. The device never promised glory. It promised a chance to survive the next contact. And that is why the laughter did not return. Because once a tiger has been made to hesitate by an infantry team, the joke becomes unsafe. It becomes a reminder that certainty can be killed, and that mockery is not protection when steel is near. They called it a spring toy until it punched through a tiger, and the joke never came back.